everyone. Welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapellos in Ottawa. Tonight, tariff talk.
We won't back down. We will respond forcefully.
Mark Carney convenes an emergency cabinet huddle on Trump's auto tariff order as the U.S. president looms large over all campaigns. We're going to bring in auto industry leaders in moments and get reaction on the campaign trail.
My message to President Trump is knock it off. Stop attacking America's friends.
This feels like a betrayal, a gut punch for absolutely no reason.
Then a little later on in the show, we've got an extra special front bench panel to break down Trump's election impact. Christy Clark, Ronna Ambrose, and Nathan Cullen will all be here live. Plus, Saskatchewan axing all carbon taxes. We've got Saskatchewan's Premier, Scott Moe, live on the program a little later on his decision to cut industrial carbon pricing in his province and his message to the feds ahead of a meeting of premiers and the Prime Minister on tariffs tomorrow. First, though,
these auto tariffs yesterday are a big deal for auto workers in the industry. And you saw the United Auto Workers Union, Sean Fain, who wasn't the greatest fan of the president on the campaign trail, came out this morning and applauded the president for this move, saying it's a great thing for auto workers who have been sold out by unfair trade practices. So the president is determined to rebuild our manufacturing base. We want more jobs, more products made right here in the United States, which means more money in the pockets of the American people at the end of the day.
U.S. President Donald Trump set to slap fresh tariffs on cars and trucks coming into the U.S. starting on April 2nd. Its actual impact, though, on Canada at this point remains unclear. Industry, however, is warning, pending how those tariffs are applied, that they could increase the cost to manufacturers and consumers and potentially jeopardize auto jobs on both sides of the border. To craft a response, Mark Carney and key cabinet ministers took time off the campaign trail for an emergency meeting in Ottawa this morning. The Prime Minister opted not to announce retaliation until the tariffs are actually imposed.
Last night, the President of the United States reached out to schedule a call. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss how we can protect our workers and build our economies. We will respond forcefully. Nothing is off the table to defend our workers and our country.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh also today asked at campaign stops about Canada's response. Take a listen to what they said.
I have a further message for President Trump. If you decide to go down this road, this is what's going to happen. Yes, you'll do damage to us in the short term, but we will fight back and we will build back. Within 4 years of a new, strong Conservative government, Canada will be completely rebuilt. We will rebuild our economy. We will not be reliant on the U.S. anymore.
We need to also make it very clear that if you want to sell vehicles in our country while this trade war is going on, then you have to have a footprint in our country. So we want jobs in our country. We have met with workers before. We're going to continue to meet with workers, and we're going to continue to amplify their voice.
With me now to talk more about the potential impact, Flavio Volpe is the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada. Brian Kingston is president and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. And Lana Payne is Unifor's national president. Hello to all three of you. Thanks for joining me. I certainly wish it, I was saying before we started to Brian, under different circumstances. Flavio, I'll start with you. I feel a bit confused. I know our viewers are by what the breadth of this is. Will we have exclusions? Will we not? What's the latest understanding you have of how this could impact the auto sector in Canada more widely?
Well, I had an understanding until about 15 minutes ago, and then I heard Howard Lutnick give a different understanding to Doug Ford. Up until 15 minutes ago, what we understood is we're going to see tariffs on every single car imported into the U.S. From whatever jurisdiction on April 3rd. For parts, they've deferred to May the 3rd while they figure out how to track American content within Canadian parts. We've also heard that any American content in Canadian-made vehicles might be exempt from that tariff, all of which is, I mean, just nuts. The latest, though, is the conversation publicly about, Lutnick called Ford, who's been a champion on this stuff, to say, let's bring the temperature down. And it might be that any Canadian vehicle that has more than 50% American content in it might be exempt. And Lana and Brian both know why I'm smiling, because I really don't know which car that is. But we've got 3 or 4 more business days before it happens. So he's either going to escalate or he's going to find an off-ramp. But it was prudent for the Prime Minister to say, and take our advice. I know that Brian and Lana talked to him as well, saying, don't fire back just yet.
Yeah, let me ask you, because that certainly stood out to me, Lana, as I listened to that press conference today. The fact that those counter tariffs were not immediately announced, that there will still be a meeting with the premiers. There is supposed to at some point be a conversation with President Trump. You were right next to Mark Carney when I think you were in a meeting actually when this executive order was signed. What was, if you can convey, whatever you feel comfortable with, what was your advice to him as far as how the feds react to this?
I mean, I'm not trusting Lutnick right now. I think none of us should take anything or everything he says with a grain of salt. The reality is he also told us to calm down 2 weeks ago. And here we were with an executive order yesterday on the auto industry. So we'll see what we're going to see from them. I think we have to be prepared for everything in this country. And what we saw in that executive order yesterday is going to be very damaging for the auto industry in Canada. Any tariffs are going to be damaging given the interconnectivity of the industry. And what I've said to Prime Minister Carney and pretty much any politician who's willing to listen is we have to be prepared in this country to do whatever we can. Everything has to be on the table to make sure that we're protecting every single Canadian job here. And that may mean doing things that are uncomfortable for automakers. It may mean all kinds of things, but we can't dismiss any of them.
Brian, I wanted to get your perspective as well on sort of what we heard so far and the response from the federal government, because as Flavio pointed out, the stakeholders of the industry were certainly saying, hey, hold your fire for now until these are imposed. Why is that the view that you took?
Yeah, we've been calling for a measured approach because we do think that there still is an opportunity to find some sort of off-ramp before these tariffs come into force. One of the notable things in this executive order is that U.S. parts and components will be exempt from the tariff. I'm seeing a recognition from the U.S. that we do have an integrated industry and that cutting Canada and Mexico out of the supply chain will be very damaging to the U.S. manufacturers. So I think we're gaining some traction on that. We obviously have more to do. I mean, the Americans send more vehicles to Canada than they do to China, Mexico, and Germany combined. We have huge amounts of U.S. content in the vehicles that we produce here, and the relationship is overwhelmingly beneficial to the United States. They have a trade surplus with Canada in automotive. So there are a lot of good reasons to keep this relationship going, and I think we need to be measured in our response and see if we can find some sort of accommodation before these tariffs come into force.
Flavio, I know that you've been on the horn with various cabinet ministers, people in the Ontario government who are involved in these conversations. You've laid out the facts that Brian has on a number of different occasions. Do you have any sense if they have punched through to any degree? Like, is there any internalization on the American side of the degree of interdependence that exists?
Yeah, look, in Canada, we speak math and science, and I think both levels of government and in both parties, everybody understands it. I just came back from Washington Monday, Tuesday with some congressional meetings. And while they acknowledge there's some math and science here, they always defer to the White House. And I think that there's a reluctance with leading Republicans to break with the White House. What we've been doing with them then is, look, I'm going to leave the math with you. So when you take a shot at Canada and you hurt Canadian auto parts suppliers, for example, there's 170 plants in 26 U.S. states with 47,500 employees that will be immediately imperiled. And try to leave with them an understanding that, just as Brian talked about interconnectivity, and Lana talked about how important the workers are in this whole space, you're not going to put Canadian workers at home and have workers in Michigan making parts or making cars, because they won't be getting any parts from us. Because just like when the Ambassador Bridge was blockaded in 2022 and when the pandemic hit, we all learned the lesson that you can't make the cars without all of the parts. And the president seems to get wind in his sails every time he gets some stakeholder who says, well, I'll soak it up, or the UAW president that says, I think it's a good idea. Well, none of those are going to be a good idea when 950,000 U.S. auto workers are not sitting at home wondering about prices of eggs. They're wondering whether they can pay the rent. And that'll come in weeks.
That leads me to a question about the companies or the people that employ Canadians here. The pressure is clearly Trump's objective, as he states it, Lana, is to force the industry out of Canada. And obviously, logistically, on a factual basis, it doesn't add up. There's a million examples of how negative that will be for Americans, too. But he keeps stating it over and over and over. Are you concerned about companies eventually facing so much pressure and so much financial pain that ultimately that is a decision they take?
Of course, because eventually they will have to make some concession to Trump to appease him, which is the biggest danger we face, that Canadian workers are squeezed by what is happening right here. And the reality is, I've said this very clearly from the beginning, we've had an auto industry in this country for well over 100 years, long before Donald Trump. We've had workers in this country building vehicles for a very long time. And the reason we do is because we had some guidelines around this. We said, if we have an auto industry, if you're going to sell in this country, we expect companies to build in this country. And we're going to have to get back to that, because the reality is we have to protect these jobs with whatever policy lever we use. And it means that, yeah, at some point, we have to say to automakers, we have to say to auto parts companies, we expect more of you here. We expect to keep this footprint. We expect to grow the industry, and there could be penalties if you decide that Canadian workers are going to be the pawns in which you appease Donald Trump. I know that's not what they're doing right now, but honestly, if Trump keeps the pressure on, this is the situation we could end up in. And the other problem is any tariff will lead to what is also a long-term risk. And the long-term risk is that we lose investment in Canada. And when we lose investment, we lose product, we lose plants, we lose jobs.
I'll give the last word on all of that to you, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a risk, but I just, again, come back to the facts and the numbers. You cannot remove Canadian production and Mexican production from North America and put that in the United States without having massive negative economic implications for the U.S. consumer. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars to build new plants in the United States, and prices will go up dramatically for Americans. That is not a sustainable policy. Add into that the potential for a global trade war as other countries start to retaliate on the United States. This is bad for all involved. We've got lots of historical lessons of what happens when protectionist policies are pursued. No one wins.
All right, I got to leave it on that note. Thanks, everyone, for the discussion. I appreciate your perspectives tonight. Brian Kingston, Flavio Volpe, and Lana Payne. And while Trump continues to throw curveballs, Canadian campaigns carry on. Mark Carney heads to Montreal for a rally this evening after that cabinet meeting we referenced earlier that took place in Ottawa. Pierre Poilievre is in British Columbia with stops in Coquitlam and Surrey. Jagmeet Singh is in Windsor, Ontario. Yves-François Blanchet in and around Montreal. And the Greens did not publish their public events today. On the policy front, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has announced a TFSA top-up where Canadians would be able to contribute an additional $5,000 a year to their tax-free savings accounts on top of the existing $7,000, as long as the additional $5,000 is invested in Canadian companies. And NDP leader Jagmeet Singh announced his plan to protect auto workers, including promising an NDP government would give all funds from counter tariffs, to workers, boost employment insurance, and remove the GST from Canadian-made cars and trucks. Up next, we're going to dig into the data that could be driving some campaign strategy. Nick Nanos, our pollster of record, will join me after a short break to look ahead to what seats might look like for each party. Hi, Hi, and welcome back to Power Play. We are continuing to talk about this federal election campaign and some very quickly changing dynamics. We've got some brand new numbers from Nanos Research. Nick Nanos, of course, is the chief data scientist and founder of Nanos, CTV's pollster of record during this election cycle, and it's shaping up to be a pretty wild one, Nick. Let's start off. You've got some brand new numbers as of Friday when it comes to seat distribution. This is where things stood when we went to an election.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Vassy, the one thing to remember is, you look at the Liberals at 157, the Conservatives at 125, but the popular vote was a statistical tie.
Right.
So one of the things we really got to remember is that in the last election, even though it was a statistical tie in popular support, the Liberals were more efficient at converting into seats, which vaulted them into the government.
Okay, and let's move on and just see where things were, because the big contrast is end of the year, prior to Justin Trudeau quitting versus now, Justin Trudeau's quit, Mark Carney's come in, Donald Trump has taken aim. This is what it looked like at dissolution, or pardon me, in December.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you see is a big blue splotches everywhere. Right. Check out the West, North, British Columbia, massive blue sweep, in Ontario. And what we're seeing here, check it out, 225, a supermajority. Just think. So if there was a showdown between Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre, it would have been a supermajority for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives.
And that was reflecting the popular vote at the time as well, right? Like you had them double digits ahead for most of last year to compare to the Liberals, right?
Yep.
So this is what it looks like essentially now.
Yeah.
And what a change.
Yeah, what a change. And this goes back to what I was talking about, Vassy. The Liberals and the Conservatives are still within the margin of error. But check it out, the Conservatives have generated more seats than the Liberals. It speaks to the fact that because right now, Conservative support has gone down in provinces like Quebec, inefficient at converting into seats. They're up in the province of Ontario, seat-rich, favoring the Conservatives right now, which means that battleground Ontario is ground zero for Pierre Poilievre if he wants to have a chance to form a government.
Let's go through some of those regions, because in Atlantic Canada, where the carbon tax was a dominant issue last year, the Liberals had really taken a hit. This is where things were officially, right? This is at redistribution. Yep. But then in December, when the Conservatives were polling where they were, it had a huge impact out east.
Oh man, think of it this way. You look at the Rock, almost basically a sweep for the Conservatives. And in the Maritimes, Dominic LeBlanc's riding, too close to call.
Wow.
In December. Still tight, and he had the advantage, but too close to call. And you can see Acadie Bathurst as kind of like the Liberal holdout. The Conservatives poised in December to win 8 of the 10 seats in New Brunswick, all of the seats in PEI, and most of the seats in Nova Scotia.
And now, let's look at what it looks like when you model things out at this moment. Just another big change.
You look at it now, and you can see the ridings in black are ridings that are too close to call in Newfoundland. You can see that central Newfoundland there. That is a fight between the Liberals and the Conservatives. You can see St. Margaret's, South Shore St. Margaret's, as too close to call right now. And even when you look at ridings like Fredericton is that little red dot, it used to be Conservative. Now it's, we predict if the election were held today, it would be tilting Liberal. But, basically a fight in the Maritimes between the Liberals and the Conservatives.
Let's swing the other way to the opposite end of the country, and in particular the greater Vancouver area. So Metro Vancouver, this is where things stood at dissolution. So we can see the Liberals and the Conservatives here. Let's show where things were as of December. It was, think about the provincial Conservatives, the boost they got from the Conservative brand more largely. It was just everywhere, painted blue.
Yeah, absolutely. So you see at the end of December, the Conservatives really poised to do well in the lower mainland of British Columbia. You see the two orange seats. That's Vancouver Kingsway and Vancouver Centre, I think, those two ridings. And but with the exception of those two ridings and a couple others, basically the Conservatives were poised to win big in British Columbia.
Let's flip it 2 months later. 3 months later, was it showing?
Yeah, check it out in terms of what's too close to call. You can see in the lower mainland in Vancouver a number of ridings that are too close to call. The NDP picking up 1 extra seat, but basically kind of like Atlantic Canada, Vancouver being a fight now between the Liberals and the Conservatives, and the Liberals and the New Democrats and the Conservatives. So it's going to be really interesting with the vote splits, how support converts into seats in the House of Commons.
Yeah, very much so. And finally, let's rest in Ontario, which, as you mentioned, is looking like fertile ground for, every party has spent a lot of this week actually in the Greater Toronto area. This is where things were when Parliament dissolved. We'll take a look now at where things were in December. So again, Popular vote was certainly taking a sweep there.
Yeah, this is kind of like, actually, remember we had the St. Paul's by-election? It's like
right,
St.
shocker.
Paul's
Yeah.
was like the thin edge of the wedge for the Conservatives, kind of the canary in the coal mine for the Liberals. And you can see basically, you know, the Conservatives picking up, especially if you can see in the west part of the city, the Oakvilles, Etobicoke Lakeshore, Mississauga Bramptons, major breakthroughs and good numbers for the Conservatives there, with, you know, Toronto with basically, you can see only 3 Liberal ridings predicted in the end of December. The rest either Conservative or too close to call.
And let's flip it now toward the end of March. It's again a different scene.
Yeah, you can see the Liberals kind of regaining strength, and I think, you know, you see Ajax Pickering, though, that area there as close races. Also back to kind of Etobicoke Lakeshore, you know, the 2 Oakvilles, Burlington, all those ridings basically in play. Basically, I guess you can see a bit of a lake effect, why don't we call that, where there's a real fight between the Liberals and the Conservatives.
We sure have a race, as this stuff underscores. Nick, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Nick Nanos is the Chief Data Scientist and founder of Nanos Research. We've got lots more coming up on Power Play after a short break. Stay right there.
I understand and respect his goal to support American workers, but I disagree with him that this is how to help them. I reject any attempts to weaken Canada, to wear us down.
My message to President Trump is knock it off. We will never be the 51st state, but we can, once again, be friends with the United States if the president reverses course on these disastrous tariff threats.
And to describe what has happened when Donald Trump stabbed us in the back, it's a betrayal. It's a betrayal, and Canadians are angry, but people in Windsor are pissed off. This feels like a betrayal, a gut punch, for absolutely no reason.
Donald Trump's trade war takes center stage yet again on this, the 5th day of Canada's 45th federal election campaign. Mark Carney was back in Ottawa for an emergency meeting with key cabinet ministers, crafting a response to Trump's 25% auto tariffs. Pierre Poilievre and Jagmeet Singh, as you just heard there, weighed in from the campaign trail, as well. Here to break down this country's tariff response and its implications for the election campaign is a special edition of our Front Bench panel. With us throughout the election campaign, former Liberal BC Premier Christy Clark is here. She's now a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Former interim Conservative leader Rona Ambrose, is with us. She's the deputy chairwoman of TD Securities. And former NDP MP and BC Minister Nathan Cullen is here. He's now a senior advisor at Strategy Corp. Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to have you on our program. I appreciate you making the time. Christy, I'm going to start with you. Was it the right call not to pull the trigger on counter tariffs today and to essentially wait until if or when they are imposed, let's say next week?
I think it was. I think counter tariffs are a mixed bag for us.
Ladies and gentlemen, on flight 149 to Calgary, please make your way immediately.
Rhonda's at the airport.
I think, Rhonda, you got to board your flight. Yeah, it's coming right there. Start again, Christy. Sorry.
For once, the flight's leaving on time. And hold on a second. So, yeah, so I think it's a mixed bag. I think that the thing about counter tariffs is if you're building furniture in BC, for example, you can maybe buy your wood from BC, but maybe not the glue, maybe not the screws and those other things. So counter tariffs for sure have an impact on all the other industries that that we want to protect here. On the other hand, though, it is a really important political message to say, okay, look, you do this to us, we're not going to sit back and just let you do it. We're actually gonna punch you back. So I think there's wisdom in waiting. We may still have to do it, but I think there are a lot of people in the business community across the country who would say, wait a minute, forest industry's already been just absolutely devastated by provincial government policy in the country. We cannot afford to make it even harder by federal government policy on counter tariffs. So let's wait a little bit. And I don't think the forest industry is the only industry in the country where that's true.
So, Nathan, from a political perspective, the announcement yesterday sort of upended things insofar as Mark Carney became Prime Minister for the next 24 hours or so, came down to Ottawa. The other leaders were talking about it as well. But it did remind you of the couple of instances during the Ontario campaign, for example, where Doug Ford went to Washington in his capacity as Premier. Is Is it a challenge for opposition parties to punch through in a moment like this when the leader of the Liberals, in effect, does carry the mantle of, holding government or being prime minister at a moment like this?
Yeah, it's an expectation. It's an interesting quirk of our moment right now that we need whoever goes into the campaign as the prime minister, who's not elected now, to do both jobs, run for his own political party, but also continue to make some decisions. There's as we all know, a caretaker responsibility where government's not meant to do extraordinary things while we're in a campaign period for obvious reasons to their own political benefit. So there's a bit of a line to walk, but I think Canadians are expecting Mr. Carney and others to continue to perform roles, particularly when the threats are so constant. I think there was some small hope from Premier Smith and others that maybe Mr. Trump, for maybe unfortunate political decision-making reasons, was going to lay off during our writ period. But his unpredictability, his willingness to continue to attack Canada against the interests of his own people, it goes worth mentioning every time that these tariffs do not help Americans, do not help American consumers. In fact, don't just hurt our relationship, but hurt individual families. And that the voice has to be very consistent. And we saw that in the clips from the various leaders, Jagmeet Singh and Pierre Poilievre, essentially echoing the need to at least have positionally this point. I don't know, to Christie's point, I don't know how long he can wait, though. I think if we're having significant tariffs that do come down on April 2nd, I think to continue to wait too long might be an indication to Mr. Trump's administration that here's an advantage that they can somehow use to their warped idea of a benefit to America.
Nathan's point, Rana, that in essence, all the leaders of the political parties, they have different ways of communicating it, but everyone is saying eventually there needs to be a response from Canada, that it should be a strong response, and that we should be collectively standing up to Donald Trump and what he's trying to do to our economy. At the same time, again, politically, there were different strategies employed today. In particular, I'm thinking of the opposition parties who still remain on the campaign trail. The NDP switched gears. They went to Windsor. They decided to make the announcement about the tariffs and their plans for support for workers and things like that. Pierre Poilievre started off his comments certainly at his event talking about that and his plans, but kept the messaging around today being around the TFSA announcement that they wanted to make from a policy perspective. They kept that intact. Which strategy do you think is ultimately beneficial? Like, which one do you think was the right one?
Well, I think both of those things are important. I think focusing on affordability is still the primary issue that Canadians want political parties to focus on. It's still the top issue at every kitchen table. Of course, the issue with Donald Trump is right there, number two. But I think also we have to recognize that what the White House said today, we don't have that much clarity and certainty around this. So we're still waiting till April 2nd. What the White House said today.
Looking for passengers.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. You got a few minutes before you have to board.
What the White I'm so sorry. I'm heading back to Calgary. What the White House said today, though, was that Canadian. I'm sorry.
It's a very Canadian moment. It's okay.
We've all been there, Rona. We've all been there.
Yeah, we sure have.
It's going to end soon, I promise.
Okay, so I'll just say quickly, what we heard from the White House today was that Canadian auto parts will remain tariff-free for now, and Canadian cars will be tariffed for any non-U.S. materials, meaning Canadian materials, Mexican materials. As all of us know, the auto sector is so highly integrated; it feels almost impossible. So I think a bit of this, a bit of this, or all of this, is a prelude to getting into the USMCA negotiation. Look, in the last USMCA negotiation, Trump was very clear: I want more auto content, auto materials from the U.S., made in the U.S., with U.S. jobs and North American vehicles, and he got that. I mean, at the end of the day, we got a good agreement, but the U.S. did get more U.S. content, U.S. materials, and North American cars. That meant he could go home, do a victory lap, and say, more U.S. jobs, more U.S. manufacturing at home. And I think he wants that again. So the sooner we push, whoever the prime minister is has to push hard to get to the USMCA negotiating table as quickly as possible. And I think this is exactly what Trump wants. He wants to renegotiate USMCA and come out of that again with more U.S. content in North American vehicles. And obviously, we have to push back on that.
Yeah, the irony is that's the deal that he negotiated. And
Exactly.
just on
He wants it again. He wants more.
Yeah, he wants more. That's true. I just did an interview with people who were, in meeting with cabinet today, and they had, there is still confusion over whether the parts are subject to it, which parts, American made, that kind of stuff. Like the White House itself has yet to issue much clarity. Like the confusion does persist. Rana mentioned affordability versus Trump. And not to say versus like they're oppositional, but they seem to be the two dominant strains of the campaign, particularly at the beginning of the week. All the announcements were around affordability, but then an event like what happened yesterday swings things back to Trump. Ultimately, do you have a sense, do you think that this sort of consensus in the punditry class that it is all about Trump is accurate, or do you have a different sense?
My sense of it is all about Trump in as much as he's just saying stuff and seeing what floats and what doesn't. I don't think he has a deep understanding of any of this stuff. He developed his understanding of this 40 years ago, or that was when he concluded why tariffs were necessary, and the world has changed so dramatically since then. And I think, though, the part of it that really is about Trump is, especially for the northern states, putting tariffs on Canadian goods is massively inflationary. Energy is, that translates into gas at the pumps, food. There's a whole bunch of other items where people will see massive inflationary increases quickly as a result of what's going on here. And so the question, I think, for Trump is, how long does he feel like he can sustain this trade war and without costing him so much in popular support that really he starts to lose his reputation amongst all those people who, quite frankly, stupidly voted for him, thinking he was going to protect the interests of the lower and middle class. He hasn't succeeded in doing it, and I think he's very vulnerable on that point. And, that does speak to the need for Canada to be strong, to be tough, and, maybe take some tough medicine, which I think is something that, all of the leaders recognize we may have to take to make this work.
Nathan, I want to ask you again about the politics of that question in particular around Trump. So a former leader of your party, Tom Mulcair, wrote a column this week for CTV essentially saying because of the existential nature of the threat of Trump, really your choices should only be between the two parties that have a feasible chance of forming government. I just read a few hours ago your response to that, and I'm wondering if you could share that, why you don't agree.
Well, I don't agree at a fundamental level with my former colleague, Tom, and for a couple of reasons. One, historically, you look back at the role the NDP has played in Canada in helping encourage, push, cajole, force governments into creating things that we hold dear, like public health care, employment insurance, old age pensions. The list should be well known, but it's worth repeating. The idea of simply standing aside, surrendering because things are tough is just not a New Democrat thing to do. If we had that, it would have been really hard to get women's rights, Indigenous rights into the Charter. It would have been hard to get all of those successes. So when we look at a moment like this, it's not just this 30 days, it's what comes next. And as Christy talked about and Rana, the pain of these tariffs are going to be felt for months and years to come. There are going to be people out of jobs and that are going to need help. There are businesses that are going to need support from the government. And when I've watched our parliaments in the past, when parties have had all the power, particularly Liberals, there have been times where they've been quite cruel, getting out of public housing, slashing transfers on healthcare payments. So having a check and balance on power is absolutely critical. And the NDP does a good job of doing that. That would be an obvious and good role for Mr. Singh. I just think all of this, trying to understand Trump's motivations, I don't know if anyone on this call can figure it out, but we used to think the market would affect him. If the market slumped, then he may reverse course in some of his dumber ideas. That doesn't seem to be true anymore. In terms of pain to his own voters and constituents that Christy talked about, I'm not convinced that matters to him either, because this is going to be very painful. I guess what he's betting on is the pain is going to be worse here. We will lose more jobs. It will cost us more tariff, counter tariff, and he can outlast us and get to somehow a better trade deal that Rana talked about than the fantastic one that he signed with Canada in his first term. That was the best ever. So looking for logic is hard. I think working at the subnational level with governors to premiers, I think is going to be critical in the next couple of years. And whoever runs this country needs to keep communities and workers in mind. And that's what the NDP is trying to do. And that's why we should continue to have a strong voice in Parliament. I think to think otherwise is just surrendering because things are difficult. And that's not the New Democrat way.
Rana, I'll give you the last word. I have sort of a two-part question. Are Tories worried about the fact that their public opinion polls in the aggregate do show a popular support for the NDP decreasing? Like usually a stronger NDP means, better shot for the Conservatives against the Liberals. And second, how, Nathan just laid out the unpredictability that we have been dealing with since the 20th of January. How much of a challenge does that make for anybody who forms government to come up with Canada's response?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say this, the unpredictability started in November. And let's just remember that for all intents and purposes, there was a pretty good chance, 50-50, that Donald Trump could get elected. So the fact that, I was with a group of investors this morning and they call the last decade the lost decade. Not the last decade, the lost decade economically, in terms of trying to get out there, attract capital investment into Canada. And we are still in that position. So far, since November, no government, not the last prime minister, not this prime minister, has made any policy announcements, changes, legislation that I have seen that will drastically, boldly transform our economy to become more resilient, stronger, more independent, up against this tariff crisis, but also once this is settled, or at least we have some certainty around it, whether it's reciprocal tariffs in perpetuity, to deal with the economy going forward. We have such a huge opportunity in this country to be the strongest economy in the Western world. We have all the parts to make that happen, but we have not made the right fiscal policy decisions. So it's time for that huge transformation. And I think that's what our party has to continue to be focused on. So you asked the question, should we talk about the tariffs or should we talk about topping up people's tax-free savings accounts? We should be doing both. Every single day. Should we be giving seniors a big tax cut and talking about the tariff crisis? We should be doing both. And that's what we did yesterday. Every single day, I want to hear from our party about what we're going to do to put money back in people's pockets, make life more affordable, give people a break. People are suffering all across this country. The tariff war is exacerbating that. But at some point, we'll have more clarity. And Trump will be gone one day. And we need to prepare for the next 20 years, not the next 2 weeks. And that has to happen with a brand new government with very bold policy.
Okay, well, we're going to have lots to talk about next week once those tariffs are supposedly announced and we can discuss and debate the various policies being put forth. I appreciate all of you making the time. Really looking forward to seeing you during the campaign. Christy Clark, Rana Ambrose, and Nathan Cullen. Coming up tonight on Power Play, we're going to get provincial reaction to those tariffs. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe will join me live after a short commercial break. The premiers will meet with the Prime Minister tomorrow to talk about Canada's response.
A lot of the automobiles that are manufactured here in Ontario have 50-60% parts from the U.S. going back and forth. The good news for the auto part manufacturers, they aren't going to be touched. I just got off the phone with the Prime Minister. I had a good conversation with the Prime Minister. He agrees 100%. We need to retaliate when it'll be both the Prime Minister and myself agree. Let's not do this till April 2nd. Let's see what's coming.
Right now, Mr. Trump doesn't respect the agreement Canada-U.S. Mexico. So we should request a full negotiation.
All of us are going to have to work together to get through this period of an economic challenge that we never asked for. But when it comes to patriotism, when it comes to the maple leaf and rallying around the flag, then I think every single Manitoban that I know is willing to step up.
Premiers there responding to U.S. President Donald Trump's latest trade move to impose 25% tariffs on foreign autos as of next week. The premiers collectively are set to meet with Prime Minister Mark Carney tomorrow to talk about how to respond if the tariffs are imposed. Saskatchewan's Premier Scott Moe is here to talk about that and his decision to kill the industrial price on carbon in his province as well. Premier, good to have you back on the program. I appreciate you making the time. I got to start on the tariffs. and get your view on the fact that Mark Carney, the Liberal leader, who is, at the moment today serving in his capacity as Prime Minister, not pulling the trigger on counter tariffs today, saying that he would essentially wait to make that decision until he spoke to the premiers and the tariffs are actually imposed. In your view, is that the right call?
Yes, and we've always said that we need to take a very measured approach to the things that the president says, because often there are nuances to some of the statements that he makes that seem quite outlandish, then they don't come into effect, or there's nuances that mitigate the impact of those. So we always have to take a very measured approach to the statements that are coming out of the White House, and also ensure that we understand we're a very diverse country in how we create wealth in various areas of the country, and so various tariffs are going to impact different parts of the country in different ways, and we need to have a full understanding of that as well. And so we should always be, and we've always said, take a moment, take a breath, and take a measured approach in our response.
Ultimately, do you think if those tariffs are imposed, that the federal government should take the remainder, for example, of the counter tariffs that are still on the table and impose them, if the tariffs are imposed?
Well, I think we have to see on what products, to what level, and what any of those nuances are. For example, if there's 50 or 60% in the automobile sector, 50% or 60% of that vehicle is built in the U.S., then it would be not subject to the tariffs. And so you have to figure out what the full impact of what being said and what being implied actually is to us before you decide on what an appropriate response should be. Should a firm response be necessary? I think we'll all work together to ensure that is the case as provincial leaders. And, the Prime Minister was currently going through a federal election as well. That being said, we also need to understand at the subnational level, what our impacts are, where they are, and to what level they are. And so that takes a few moments after you hear whatever, quite simply rhetoric that comes out of the White House to figure out exactly what those full impacts are and to decide on and maybe not always agree on, but to discuss at least what a response is.
Let me ask you, when you talk about the subnational difference in impact, if I'm interpreting that in layman's terms, and correct me if I'm wrong, it means that if there's auto tariffs, they're going to impact Ontario way more, for example, than they would impact Saskatchewan. Will that inform your level of support of a national response? Like, could you be hesitant to support things that the federal government does because Ontario is more impacted, or is it an all-for-one kind of thing?
Well, we're seeing connections in this space. For example, one of the more urgent impacts that we're having in Saskatchewan is actually the tariffs from China on canola, 100% tariff, and that's a response to a Liberal policy on trying to protect the EV industry in Eastern Canada. And so we need to have the discussion about, what are the impacts of a response? What are the potential reactions that might be? And we saw a reaction in this case that is going to have a tremendous impact on the Saskatchewan agriculture sector, really at the expense of protecting an industry that isn't that large, the EV sector in Eastern Canada. And so, that's where we are today. And I'm one of the voices at that table on behalf of the ag industry. But we need to ensure that we are having those same discussions when it comes to any potential tariffs that are coming out of the United States. They may have an impact on one area of the nation, and we do all support one another as Canadians. But we need to understand that, are there indirect impacts that could occur with counter tariffs, with responses to those counter tariffs, whatever that might be. And so it really is a much more complex discussion and a much more complex situation than maybe what it seems at the surface. It's not as simple as, just hitting back dollar for dollar or anything of that nature. It's much more complex, and it takes, a little bit more measured discussion and response, and which takes a little bit of time.
And I do understand that point, and certainly I think Canadians from coast to coast to coast are feeling a lot of sympathy and empathy for the farmers, for example, the canola farmers, the pork producers that are so distinctly impacted by those Chinese counter tariffs that you mentioned. But that policy that was pursued last year wasn't just about protecting the EV industry. It was following discussions with the United States under the Biden administration, who had national security concerns about the degree to which China was subsidizing an industry that they felt was very unfair. And Donald Trump feels the same way. Are you saying that we shouldn't be hard on China?
No, I'm saying that the Prime Minister of Canada should be reaching out to China, like they are to the United States, if they're truly serious about defending all of the jobs in Canada. That includes the farmers, and it includes the folks working in the canola industry. And so there needs to be an equal response on behalf of all Canadians from whoever the federal government is and whoever the Prime Minister is. And I'm not sure we've seen a commitment to that to this point.
But reach out to China how? I mean, they are essentially an adversary at this point. They detained 2 Canadians for more than 1,000 days. Like, what kind of outreach should you conduct with a human rights record like the one that country has?
Well, by that very, they're also an export market, as is the United States, as is India, and I think at some point we've and media, many media places have said that they're all adversaries. Most certainly, when you look at the United States of America and the rhetoric that comes from the president, I don't think anyone would believe, if you looked at the last 2 or 3 weeks, that historically the United States of America is our largest trading partner and our largest ally. It certainly doesn't seem like that, and it doesn't feel like that as a Canadian the last number of weeks. The fact is we have export markets around the world, and you may not agree with much of what they do. However, you do need to have a relationship with them to some degree, or at least be able to make a call and say, listen, you have 100% tariffs on a couple of $1 billion of canola oil that's coming into that market. We're committed to, should we come through this federal election, having a discussion and a negotiation on how we can find our way through that to a much more free and fair trade environment. The same phone call, I think, and the same negotiation that is happening on behalf of not only the auto industry, but the steel and aluminum industry with the President of the United States. We don't have to like or agree with, other countries' views on a number of things, but if they are export markets, you have to have the ability to reach out and resolve differences when it comes to trade.
Okay, Premier, I ran out of time, and the commercial is, I can't not take it. I apologize. I wanted to ask about the industrial carbon price. I hope you'll join me again, and we can have a full discussion about your decision there, because I know you've now decided to remove the industrial side as well. I appreciate you making the time for our program this evening. Live TV, my apologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Thanks so much. That's Saskatchewan's Premier Scott Moe. We're back in a moment. Welcome back to Power Play. 5 days down. I can't even talk. I'm only 5 days in. 32 to go in Canada's 45th federal election. I wanted to tell you a little bit about where you can catch our coverage, because it is going to be extensive. We're going to be there for the leaders' debates, for example, on the campaign trail, all throughout the election, all the way until Election Day. And I will be here for you on Power Play during this election campaign, Monday to Friday, 5 days a week, live every day at 5 o'clock Eastern, 3 o'clock Mountain, and on ctvnews.ca. You can stream our program. Every Sunday, we'll be live with Question Period at 11 o'clock Eastern, 9 a.m. Mountain on CTV, CTV News Channel. And again, you can stream that online at ctvnews.ca. You can catch me every day across the iHeartRadio Talk Network from noon until 2 o'clock Eastern. And then also we are launching a brand new campaign podcast this Friday. That just happened. I'm going to analyze this election, and you can get all your campaign events once a week, every Friday. Thanks for watching.